quick note on why we chose these 4 people, aside from the fact that we love them. You know, in technology, which is what I mostly write about, we talk about adoption curves, right? We talk about, you know, as a new technology comes into the market, like some small percentage of people adopt it, you know, cell phones, or like the iPhone right after it came out, or like computers in the 1980s, or any of these things, right? But the truth is that lots of different cultural things, ideas and new practices, also have really similar adoption curves. And so the people that you're looking at here are cultural early adopters. In their chosen fields, they're at the forefront of practice and are really trying to bring you new ideas before they hit the mainstream. Does anyone here know who the artist Gutzon Borglum is? One, a few. That's amazing. Okay, most people don't know. I want to let you know that you all know his work. He was a sculptor of Mount Rushmore. And Adam Lerner, right here, might be the world's foremost expert on Mount Rushmore, thanks to his PhD at Hopkins, which examined American monuments. From there, he entered the museum world, had some stints at the Contemporary Museum in Baltimore, and then also at the Denver Art Museum. After that, he wanted to strike out on his own, and so he decided to found an art space in a suburban shopping mall outside of Denver, shopping complex. It was called the Laboratory of Art and Ideas at Belmar, and he quickly established himself as one of the most innovative and creative people in the art world. And so when the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver, the MCA, came looking for someone to run their beautifully designed new building, they found him. He's also part of the inspiration for this session, because at Denver MCA, if you ever get a chance, MCA Denver, sorry, he does a program called Mixed Taste, where he pairs sort of unlike speakers. So I gave a talk about compressed air, and my counterpart gave a talk about art history and alchemy. And you find unexpected connections between these things, and that's what we're hoping to do in this session. Amanda Michel, we appropriately met, Sarah and I, when her project with ProPublica, the investigative journalism outlet, beat our Longshot magazine, a project we do, out for an Innovation in Journalism Award. She's been at the absolute edge of digital media and politics since such things really existed. Do you remember all the Howard Dean excited youth in 2004? That was Amanda. After a stint at Harvard's Berkman Center, she moved to the Huffington Post, where she ran the groundbreaking political crowdsourcing project Off the Bus. And now has ended up, most curiously, after her time at ProPublica, back at a newspaper, The Guardian, the UK Guardian, running many of their social media things. I just want you to believe me when I tell you that she is one of the sharpest minds on digital media and one of the most articulate advocates for how social media can be more than just marketing. She'll be presenting with Matt Thompson, who's sitting to her right. And he's a digital media inventor who's just constantly on the edge of what are like new realities or science fictions, and it's always kind of hard to tell because he's out so far beyond where most people are thinking. He now runs sundry digital things, as he says, at NPR, and he is another eloquent advocate for digital journalism in all its forms. If there's any budding journalists, I think there might be some in here. He's going to entice you to go out, run out and code as quickly as possible, along with your writing. And I think with Matt and Amanda, we really couldn't have two better people to talk about the future of media and political media. Last, but obviously not least, Gustavo Arellano, sitting right there. I actually met Gustavo in the best possible way because my dad is and was his biggest fan. When he was writing the Ask a Mexican column for OC Weekly, hysterically funny and informed by Gustavo's Master's of Latin American Studies from UCLA, my dad, who'd never really taught me much about Mexican culture, despite being from there, just outsourced that whole project to Gustavo. So I met him 5 years ago in Seattle when his first book came out, which was Ask a Mexican. And in the 5 years since, he's just been skyrocketing forward in media. He's had two other books, one a personal history of Orange County, and the other his most recent book, which is called Taco USA, and it uses Mexican food to sort of probe the borders and boundaries between American and Mexican culture. And he's also the editor of OC Weekly there in Southern California.
Final comment, we're going to be tweeting these talks using the hashtag AspenFutures. If you would like to use that, please do. And in general, just as Alexis already mentioned, we really want to encourage everybody to kind of draw connections. These presentations have some boundaries between them, but ideally we're kind of breaking down the boundaries and finding the commonalities and the interdisciplinarity between them, and that makes interesting things happen. So without further ado, our first speaker is Adam Lerner.
Thanks. I love it when people talk about my work as a graduate student, at least until I pay off my student loans. I'd like to make sure that it gets some airplay. Well, actually, I was a graduate student for a very long time, for about 12 years, and I sometimes felt embarrassed to admit to my peers that I was writing my dissertation on Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor of Mount Rushmore, because of its lowbrow associations. But now, what amazes me is something very different. What amazes me is that I actually failed to learn what is probably the one single great lesson of studying an artist, especially an artist like him. So in sort of the 6 years of research and writing about this artist who found his voice by attempting to do something that nobody else had done before, it never occurred to me that there's a lesson in that. There's a lesson in that actually might apply to me, that I might actually think about doing something that no one else had done before. And it's actually the nature of academic pursuits to remain an observer of other people who break the rules. Now, as the director of a museum of contemporary art, actually, I realize that it's actually the nature of all cultural institutions to remain detached as an observer of those people who break the rules. That actually, it is the nature of our cultural institutions to cultivate a sense of maybe appreciative or respectful detachment from the art, from the risk takers. While it's the nature of art that, as we've inherited it, to actually be about breaking rules and going against conventions, there's something about the formal presentation of museums that actually it's very similar to a sort of academic thesis, that's similar to a concert hall or the opera, that separates the visitors, the audience, from their own creative impulses. So the great implicit message of all of our cultural institutions is that the artist has made the sacrifice so that you don't have to. And that's basically the Christian model, which I think is something that I've sort of always, as working as a museum director, have sort of tried to work against. So museums and traditional cultural institutions, they point to the art and they say, "Isn't that an original voice?" But the audience, what they see is they see the institution, which has no original voice of its own, generally. So it's like when you point in front of a dog. For those people who have dogs, I just got a dog, I know. You point in front of a dog, the dog, what does it do? He sniffs your finger, right? So the dog sees you, not what you're pointing at. And the same thing as the audience is, for cultural institutions, they tend to see you, the cultural institution, as the framer of all that creative energy that the artist has sort of mustered. Which means that the institution has to be a sort of model. The institution has to model themselves how we can learn from these creative artists to express an original voice, to break out of existing conventions. And so if you want to foster the idea that the artist sacrifices, well, the artist's sacrifice should be an inspiration for us to take chances, for us to break the rules, for us to sort of clear away those conventions and start to see the world afresh. If we want to sort of foster that attitude, then we, as an institution, have to do that ourselves. And that's actually what I'm going to talk to you about from here on, is sort of how I've tried to sort of, as an institution, have an original creative voice. Or successful or not, it's the attempt to model what it is we learn from our artists. I began to learn to do that in 2004 when a real estate developer invited me, as Alexis mentioned, to create a cultural institution in the suburbs of Denver where I was sort of freed from any strictures of what a cultural institution ought to be. And I began with a lecture program, as he mentioned, or I called the institution, as he mentioned, I called it the Lab, and our logo was a Labrador Retriever. I don't have, by the way, a Labrador Retriever, I have a Dachshund, but we thought it was funny. Maybe you don't, I don't know. So we started with the lecture program, and that lecture program we called Mixed Taste, tag team lectures on unrelated topics, and this one was Andy Warhol and artificial lighting. And we had one speaker speak on one subject for half an hour, and a second speaker speak on a completely unrelated subject for half an hour, and then a question and answer on both at the same time. Now, there we have it. We are in an unleased storefront space in this shopping district, and there's about 20 people in the audience on that. This is about 2 weeks into it. There you have, a few weeks later, we have maybe like about 75 people now showing up. On the left, you have a professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, Jake York, talking about T.S. Eliot, and then you have a grocer talking about fresh meat sausage. This is a sample season for you. Carnivorous plants and color field painting. Earth art and goat cheese. Capoeira and Le Corbusier. Chinese opera and Alfred Hitchcock. Walt Whitman and whole hog cooking. What we do is we pair things according to whether they sound good next to each other, and that sounded great. Tequila and dark energy in the universe. So you're starting to get what happens. Your mind sort of immediately makes the connection, doesn't it? Soul food and existentialism. Prairie dogs and Gertrude Stein. And then the one which is, of course, obvious, Marxism and kittens, kittens, kittens. Now, the point of all of this is that the mind naturally follows existing patterns when thinking about any subject. Think about where you want to go to dinner on an average day, and your mind will always go to the same places it always goes to, right? You've got to trick the mind to get to something new. So by forcing the mind to make a connection in different realms, it fosters new patterns of thinking, breaking us out of the old patterns, which is why Salman Rushdie says, a bit of this and a bit of that is how newness enters the world. So we started to get sellout crowds. The developer built a separate building for us where we would have these kind of programs as well as international contemporary art exhibitions. Our motto was, because culture is big, like Canada. We also thought that was funny. Obviously, we have a very different sense of humor here. So we did exhibitions of international contemporary art, like this work by Fang Li Jun, but there was a sense of play in everything we did. So we were across the street from this place called Dick's Sporting Goods, and we had a sign in our window saying, "Welcome to the lab. We're not Dick's." And then we had to actually apologize for that. So we actually published something which said, like, the lab sincerely apologizes to our neighbors, Dick's Sporting Goods, for the sign in our window saying we're not Dick's. Apparently we are. It's funny. So what happens is that through play, we not only deflated the pretensions that are normally associated with high art, but we created a sense of the unexpected. So that we're not sort of saying that this is art, but it's the playful spirit of art. So joke making became for us a model for creativity, for breaking out of what you usually expect from any kind of art institution. Well, then in 2009, with the popularity of the lab's programming, as Alexis mentioned, I was offered the position of the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art. So now the class clown becomes the class president. And at MCA Denver, we are a contemporary art museum, but we added the dog to our logo because we both we believe that we both are a museum preserving the tradition of art, but also we're a lab. We're a laboratory for experimenting with what the future of art is, with the future of a museum might be. And in that, we try to develop a new language for contemporary art that would be outside of what traditional museums tend to do. This is our program, Art Fitness Training. We program Feminism and Co., where subtitled Art, Sex, and Politics, where, for example, this is led by Elisa Author and Gillian Silverman, two professors. Here, a sample program would be where we paired a woman who is a leading salesperson of sex toys at passion parties, paired her with a leading Tupperware salesperson, and followed by a sociologist who studies women's-based industries. And there was a kind of like bringing together the sort of cultural richness all in one place and understanding the sort of the various ways that there's a kind of understanding of our culture that is its very fabric. What is the very fabric of our lives that is both commercial culture and also sort of not really looked at on a normal basis. We did a program called Art Meets Beast, where we had an artisan butcher who fabricated a carcass in front of an audience. Meanwhile, we had a guy named Roger Green playing the guitar. He was a vegetarian. And so we called it the vegetarian option. And we had Sarah Rich and Nicola Twilley leading talks about the relationship between meat and design, going everywhere from the animal itself all the way through to the restaurants in the city. The point is to connect art to those creative forces that actually make up our civilization at large. And through these live programs, what we become as an institution is we become co-producers with these other creative people out there, co-producers with the artists as well. And so as co-authors, in a sense, we develop our own unique voice as an institution. But I think more than anything else, though, we end up relying upon the creativity of our staff. The people who want to work at an art museum are people who are attracted to creative endeavors. These are incredibly creative people, and we've got a sort of young generation of folks who work there who you have to actually work to kind of keep down their creative spirit, which actually most cultural institutions do. And we try to do the opposite. Hold on. So here's Sarah and Nicola. So for example, we did an exhibition called Energy Effects, which featured here thermonuclear weapons paired alongside a video work by Gonzalo Lebrija. And when our exhibition manager, Nick Salisi, went to go return those weapons to the Air and Space Museum where he bought them, he decided that he would wear a bunny suit. And there you see him with his assistant, and he drove around in a flatbed truck wearing a bunny suit. The rest of the staff, by the way, wanted to play a prank on him and wanted to have him arrested, so they wanted to call the cops on him. That would be funny. But that didn't happen. He's an artist, but this is a kind of like creative spirit that sort of takes place within the organization that I think is not about art, it's about energy. And that energy has this natural gravitational pull to it. It's not even something we're marketing. It's something that just becomes an attractive force. There you have my assistant at the time, Erin Roberts, who for our event, Seis de Mayo, she dressed as a taco and played the trumpet next to a donkey who's also carrying a trumpet during this fundraiser. We have our graphic designer, Alex Stevens, who can't do anything without being fabulous. And this is our visitor services director, Andy Lines, who organizes a Friday night, Andy Lines, who organizes a Friday night event called Black Sheep Friday. And one night he organized an event, for example, called Museum Professional Wrestling, where he invited museum professionals to engage in thumb wrestling competitions. And we still do mixed taste at the programming. So at mixed taste, there are Sarah Bai, by the way, these crowds now are like 300 plus people at these events. We sell out. We have to use it in an industrial space across the street. But Sarah Bai, who produces these programs, she likes to work up gags all the time. So we give away at each event, we give away a raffle. And in this case, what we did once, we gave away free tickets to the King Tut exhibition at the Denver Art Museum. And the winner just had to redeem these 2 used tires at the Denver Art Museum to collect their winning tickets. But we didn't tell the Denver Art Museum that. So we never did that again. So anyway, the point of all of this is that why do we have art? Why do we have art if we cannot ourselves learn from the artist to break the rules, to find new patterns of thinking and doing things through play, and somehow to connect to each other as human beings through laughter, through sort of somehow shaking things up and sort of not being as professionals to each other, as an institution to a visitor, but actually as being human to each other. And we do exhibitions of art, but as a museum will do. But the important thing is, by modeling creativity for our visitors, we hope that they will be able to see our exhibitions in a different light. We want them to be actually inspired by our artists to themselves be creative. And we want them to believe that they too can recreate the world. So we believe in Masterworks. This is not to sort of say like, oh yeah, to wear a bunny suit is the same as to make a masterwork of art. We believe in Masterworks, but we try to instill the idea that the core of every work of art is the authentic creative act, which is common to everyone. And to do that, you need to do it yourself. You can't just say it. You need to do it as an institution. That's what inspires other people to do it too. And then there's a couple of institutions I'll just end with, which are crucial to our attitude about art and culture. One is an exhibition that I co-organized with Elisa Author, focused on the American counterculture of the 1960s and 70s. Now, this is a crucial one. It's called West of Center, and it's a large-scale exhibition. What it does is it looks at certain sort of creative individuals in the 60s and 70s. And why it's interesting is that these people, I believe, have defined an alternative legacy for culture that actually continues to exist today. And these are people, here is a picture of Drop City Commune near Trinidad, Colorado, sort of a geodesic dome-oriented commune. And these are people who didn't necessarily define themselves as artists, but they set out to live artistically. And in doing so, they sort of set out to make the world that they wanted to live in, and so they inspired other people to do the same. And that was an attitude you also found in the punk era, which followed. And this is also an exhibition we did, centered around the work of Bruce Conner, who you see here, where we explored in this exhibition this idea, which is, again, the opposite of what is at the mainstream of cultural institutions today. The attitude is that when I see somebody on stage doing something creative, expressive, the feeling that cultivated within the punk rock is that I can do that too. And that's what actually most people who were the audiences of punk in those early days also just formed bands themselves. And that, along with the counterculture, is the origins, effectively the origins of the DIY culture that is everywhere today, especially amongst youth culture. That is the origins of the sort of spirit that you see amongst my staff. The people who sort of believe that they're not trying to necessarily define what they're doing as art, but they're trying to sort of do things more interestingly in the world. They try to live the world that they feel is more interesting place to live in. And the question is to let that happen. So the DIY attitude, I believe, now dominates youth culture. More importantly, I think it's everywhere in our culture and society. And those people who are the leaders of, I think actually the future of our culture and society are those people who actually are identifying those creative forces within themselves in any field, in any profession. And in some level, what they're doing is modeling themselves after artists and using art as the archetype for innovation, for risk-taking, for creative thinking. And so it's up to the cultural institutions now to begin to understand that too. Thanks.
All right. Thanks. Amanda and I I have the rare opportunity of getting to query Amanda about her insights on the future, and we're going to kind of interview each other a little bit. Before I think we start talking about the future, I think we want to put it in context a little bit. Amanda, in 2008, you were at the Huffington Post. Mm-hmm. You're now at The Guardian, and in between, you were at ProPublica, 3 very different places. I'm curious, we're in an election year right now. From when you think about what the campaign environment was like in 2008, what's changed since?
So there's been a really radical shift, and it largely is because more of us have our lives online, and the sort of ephemera of our lives are online. So in 2008, I was actually hired by the Huffington Post to run what was called Off the Bus. It's an unconventional name, sometimes a difficult name. It's kind of like calling hardball the show, not softball. But the basic premise was to get our readers engaged in the campaign coverage, and to, as much as possible, make sure that the campaign coverage wasn't so focused on the actual race. So, the barbs that were tossed back and forth between the candidates, and to really try and understand what was happening on the ground in communities around the country. Now, what was so interesting to me, what's very interesting to me now, looking back, is how formalized an approach we took. We recruited people on the Huffington Post to be what we called citizen journalists. It's a very professionalized effort. The idea was you're to sign up, and while you have your full-time job, you're in some ways to embody the life of a journalist. Now, it turns out the project went on for a year and a half. We broke some very big stories. We piloted lots of different features in the site. But we found out, I think, is something that most people in media recognize today. And that was, of the 12,000 people who participated in the project, only about, 14% were interested in writing full-length pieces and doing reporting on their own. But for many other people, they wanted to sort of dip in and out of the process. And now when you look online and you look at different news sites, I'm sure you've had this experience, almost all of them are asking readers, take a look at this. What have you seen? Here's how to contribute your photos. And the very formalized approach we took in 2008 has largely been accepted. It's sort of an everyday practice for most media institutions. And so at the time, I think we were very romantic about the approach, and now it's quite commonplace. The big shift in campaign coverage that we're experiencing now, and it's really a big challenge for reporters, is how much the campaigns now rely on data to do their campaigning. I'm going to tell you a little sort of story. Earlier this year, a lot of reporters and political analysts were pointing their fingers at Romney and saying, how is it he only has just a handful of offices in Iowa? How is he really going to try and win the state if he just has these few offices people can walk into? And what a lot of us hadn't realized is that several years before, people who worked with Romney had helped identify, using data, using records that his campaign had, a very small percentage of people who were die-hard Romney supporters. And what they did was they asked him to call other supporters, who then ID'd other potentially die-hard Romney supporters, to then call others. And in effect, a lot of their campaign work in Iowa was done largely through the internet, through an online call center. Now, if you flash back to 2008 and you think about the thousands, millions of people online who were making T-shirts, putting up their own posters, who are making media constantly, now, in effect, what you have, I think, especially in a campaign year in which, frankly, you can say there's a bit of lackluster interest on both sides, a lot of the activity, the sort of engine driving the campaigns, is largely under the hood. So if you're a reporter and you're trying to make sense of this, you don't actually have the benefit that you had in 2008, which is the sort of outpouring of vocal support online. You're really trying to figure out the machinations of campaigns by watching to see, for example, what emails they may send where and with what subject lines, because you're using that kind of information to understand their strategy. It's a sort of profound difference, and I think a profound challenge.
I think when I look at user behavior and I look out at how the folks that we are reporting for and telling stories to, how they've changed and their behavior has changed in the intervening years, the thing that sticks out to me is the new ubiquity of media. We've had cell phones, mobile devices for a long time now, the better part of the last decade. The iPhone was introduced in 2007. In the time since, in those 5 years, smartphones have 50% of the adult US population has a smartphone. It's insane how much people have now worked media into the fabric of their everyday life. Kaiser did a study called Generation M2 just last year, in which they went out to 8 to 18-year-olds and surveyed how much time they were spending with media on a given day. And the dramatic uptick, it actually doubled. If you go back to 2004, it's about 350 minutes a day. Now, it's approaching 700 minutes a day that folks are spending with media. And that's not that they are just watching TV for 700 minutes in a day. It's that media is now a layer on top of everyone's daily experience. I have a good friend that I believe Alexis had mentioned, named Robin Sloan. He is a media inventor and writer. And a few years ago, we had created a video looking out at the future of media and what will happen over the next 10 years, back in 2004. We reconvened last year for the Society for News Design to take a whack at this question of, okay, in the years since, what's changed and what's changing? And the way we chose to tackle that question was we wanted to take a common story that would be told across media, across as long as humankind has been telling itself stories. And so we told the story of a storm, which is a news story that a storm destroying a town. Or severely damaging a town, which is a news story not only which has been told since time eternal, since the flood, of course, but is one that we tell with increasing frequency today. And so we looked at as many examples as we can find from across time, going back to an ancient Greek amphora that depicted this tale of a storm, a giant storm wiping away a town, and we fast forwarded through time. Through telegraphs and newspapers, and ultimately today to social media, and then beyond. And the sweep, when you collect all of that, all of those forms of telling the story all together, the single thing that stood out was we've gone from having media in these appointment moments. Media is something that you go to at 6:30 after you're finished with your workday and you're watching the evening news with your family around the television, to media as this texture, this thing that you are constantly both suckered by and also buffeted by in your daily life. That ubiquity, I think, is one of the biggest changes, and we still are struggling, I think, to grapple with how that changes what we should be saying and how we should be telling stories.
Completely. I mean, that's why in 2008 we're using these very formalized approaches, asking people to sign up and giving writers assignments. And now I think a lot of people know that if they go to a campaign event, they expect themselves to take pictures or to post something on Facebook. And before, we were asking people to do that in a much more sort of formal approach. Well, I think, in the last few years, we've also seen other big shifts. We've seen, I think, in many instances, grassroots communities organizing themselves, right, for the purposes of political power. You can look at SOPA, you can look at PIPA. And I'm really curious to hear from you, at your vantage point at National Public Media, how has the dynamic between media and citizens changed? In what ways?
Yeah, I think that one of the fundamental shifts has been between, we used to be a broadcasting organization. We used to send out messages to people. And this is now no longer a revelation that we sit alongside people talking with one another. What they use these mobile devices to do more than anything else is not actually to listen to us, but to talk with each other. And now we sit in that space. We are there right alongside them as they are on Twitter talking with their friends about what they're going to do tonight. Then there's Morning Edition sending out a tweet about what's happening in Syria. Right there in that space. And that juxtaposition is actually, for us, I think, at NPR, it's quite sweet. We consider ourselves to have this sort of uniquely intimate medium of radio. We're whispering in your ear. And now, coupled with that notion of ubiquity before, the fact that an increasing part of our audience, so listenership for NPR, has been growing over the past several years. In contrast to what's happening with a lot of media, and part of that is because people can now carry us with them in places. They can carry us with them on their run, or at the gym, or while they're cooking in a way that was more difficult to do before. And so that intimacy of being in a communication medium and the slippages between people talking to one another and people being spoken to by media has, I think, created a drastically new dynamic for us. And I'm curious, you have done a lot of efforts working with citizens in all contexts of producing journalism. How has that changed for you?
So when I was at ProPublica, we spent just about a year focusing on what we called explainers. And the idea was, we can cover the story, we can dig up the details, do a 6-month, 12-month long investigation, But sometimes people have questions that are pressing, that are much like the questions, well, we know them because we ask them of ourselves, we ask them of our friends, like, what does this really mean? What is the significance of this bill? And we found that actually working on very simple pieces that were aimed to answer the questions that we might see people asking in their Facebook feed, asking on Twitter, were actually the kinds of posts that would get a tremendous resonance among people, and also the feedback that we got from our readers is that they were tremendously useful. For myself, I'm particularly interested in ways in which readers, in which citizens can help, frankly, hold those in power accountable. And so a lot of times I spend my time thinking about, like, where are there collective action problems that exist out there in the world? And so a project that I did at ProPublica, which we called the Stimulus Spot Check. It was shortly after the Recovery Act had moved through. There were lots of big promises about, what sort of jobs we could expect, what kind of sort of transformation we would see economically in our communities. And the question that we posed to our readers was, well, can we really tell what's going on? Like, one of the indicators, the leading indicators that Biden had pointed everyone to were construction sites, that we're going to be hiring people to work on sites around the country, and that's one of the ways in which we can sort of get back on our feet. And we thought, well, let's actually find out if that's happening. And so I put up a post on ProPublica saying, we can either wait for the administration to release figures, this was in this early summer, in early fall, and trust that they got the measurements right, or we can sort of take matters in our own hands. And so I asked readers to help us identify the progress that was made at about 550 sites around the country, which ProPublica's statistician told me was 4.5% of the construction sites around the country, which gave us the statistical soundness that we would need. And what did people do? They called their local DOT offices, Department of Transportation offices. They would stop by different sites. And what we found is that actually that gusher of work was sort of much further down the pipeline than we expected. For me, though, what was most valuable about this were the kinds of conversations that I had with my readers, like, oh, it was actually, sometimes a hassle to get this information. I made 5, 6, 7 phone calls, but I got the information that I wanted. 2, people would actually say, oh, journalism is hard and annoying. And I think especially in these days, a lot of times we're trying to make the case for the work that we do. A lot of the costs of journalism, I think especially at a place like ProPublica, in which reporters, they go down the rabbit hole, but that's after they found the rabbit hole. If you're an investigative reporter, you've got to find that story, and it can just take you months. And so actually bringing readers into the process was one of the, I think, more efficient but transformative ways of making the case for journalism, like how hard it is to actually make sense of what's happening out there in the world. Now, the real challenge, though, in doing these sorts of projects is you need certain kinds of skills, like you have to know how to organize information and people, and I think actually some of the more dramatic instances we've seen in which people have held power in account, whether it's for journalistic purposes or not, have actually been largely spontaneous. There's a fantastic example actually in Germany in which a major politician was found to have plagiarized a lot in his thesis, and people sort of discovered this because someone put up a wiki, and essentially lots of researchers and academics began copying and pasting part of his thesis online and then finding out where he had pulled the copy from. So I think the big challenge for media institutions, frankly, is to really keep their eye on the ball because, like you're saying, Matt, the sort of ubiquity of media can sometimes give the false impression that you really know what's happening in the world, because it's very easy to point to a tweet here, a tweet there, and pull up Facebook posts and to think, so long as I'm making sense of the ephemera, like what's coming up, what I can just easily see, I've got an answer. But the truth is, a lot of stories are much more difficult to find, and there are plenty of people, too, who don't have a voice. So I think the futurist.
I reject that title.
But I mean, in your position at NPR, in which you are working side by side with reporters and editors, and largely helping people see the skills that they need to learn, the ways in which to think about things differently, like what do you see coming down the pipeline?
Well, when we think about storytelling particularly, and when I'm working with the reporters that I work with, one of the essential and central concepts that I've tried to wrap my head around and that I try to work through with the journalists that I collaborate with, is this notion that we're moving from stories towards streams. That this notion, we have told each other stories, humans, we've told each other stories forever, and we will tell each other stories forever. Stories are powerful concepts, but this notion of the classic story, the beginning, the middle, the end, with the little spike of catharsis right before you reach that finish, that is being augmented by this constant stream, this flow of information. We have a reporter, our senior editor for social media, Andy Carvin, who is tracking constantly the events that are happening right now in the Middle East over Twitter. And he's created quite a profile and quite a crowd for himself, people who follow this constant stream, this flow of tweets from all over the Middle East, from Libya and Tunisia and Syria, Egypt. It's a very different experience, experiencing a story in that fashion, this not really with a beginning point or an ending point. Clive Thompson, who's a technology writer who I really like, once likened this stream-like experience to proprioception, this ambient awareness, the fact that proprioception, that we know where our arms are, our limbs and appendages are in space at any given time. That notion that something like Twitter gives you the sense of the texture of the lives of the people that you follow in a very different way than ever before, that you actually kind of do dip into these lives over 24 hours. That idea of how we tell stories, or the question of how we tell stories, when, as the writer Paul Ford put it, we are encountering an end to endings, the epiphanator that we seek in every media story that we come across that says, this is what this is about. Mm-hmm. We no longer have that mooring. How we tell stories in that age, in my universe, part of what we're doing is trying to pull back the lens a little bit, zoom out, and actually tell a larger story over time, to hook people into an ongoing narrative, to, if you will, kind of bring them along with us on a quest. A lot of the reporters that I work with, one of the things that's long been true of good journalism is great journalism often doesn't start with an answer. It starts with a great question. It's something that you don't know. That process of discovery, that quest of trying to figure something out is a key part of doing fantastic journalism. And I encourage our journalists to share that question, to start and hook their audience into that overarching question of, for example, how will the Pacific Northwest meet the renewable energy targets it set for itself by 2020? This is a question we don't know the answer to. It has a lot of complex parts, but every day, over the course of a year, we can start attacking different parts of that question, which produces great stories that are part of this unending stream, this flow, that I think actually can make people both more engaged in these types of questions and more informed. Mm-hmm. How do you approach this question of how storytelling will change?
I mean, I think what you're pointing to is there's this real need to, as you usually put it, to give context, right? Because we all see these sort of abbreviated blips and bytes that are just sort of running by. And the question is, well, how do we really make sense of something that's greater? I mean, I think some of the other trends that we've talked about are things like the visual, that more and more we're going to be making sense of the world through video, through images. And I think you can look at a place like Facebook and know that it's a massive photo album, but also we're far more often telling stories by taking pictures. I mean, a photo can just has such a sort of masterful way of setting a scene, as can just a short video clip. And so I think a lot of people talk about whether or not we've actually been in this, we've been existing in a time in which orality, so the sort of spoken, like the written word, is now, we're going to move towards much more of the spoken word, but also the sort of moving image. I think certainly for the journalists at The Guardian, one of the real challenges and one of the things we focus on a lot is frankly, like Matt's saying, how to actually bring people along an ongoing story. Because the archetypes that oftentimes we work in, some of them make a lot of sense, like the article. It reflects an older production process in which you sat down, you had your morning paper, and then you moved on. But now when information's coming at you, the question is how to sort of tether things together. so that if you're dipping in, you can really make meaning quickly and in a sort of memorable way. Well, I think I've seen Alexis flashing at us, so I know we have to bounce off our stools.
I think we'll be back for a Q&A.
Yes.
Thank you, Amanda.
Awesome. Since I'm the cheap tequila to all this fine wine, I'm going to be short, sweet, and to the point, but no lime wedge. Sorry. My name is Gustavo Arellano. I am the editor of the OC Weekly. We're an alternative newspaper based out in Orange County, California. We're the sister paper of the Village Voice, Westward, Seattle Weekly, and we specialize in yellow journalism. We specialize in telling inconvenient truths. We get politicians in jail. We get innocent people out of jail. We have an obsession with neo-Nazis and Armenian genocide deniers and all these horrible people. And in my job specifically, I tell the inconvenient truth of perhaps the most vexing problem, the most vexing supposed problem affecting the United States today. What are we going to do with all these damn Mexicans? There are so many Mexicans here, and that's all you hear about in the media. So far this year, what have we had? We had one story that minority births now are minority births are now the majority. In other words, white births are declining while minority births are going up, of course, because of that Latin blood and their fecundity that never stops. You also had, what was the other big thing? Of course, the 2012 election. Oh, what is this? The Latino vote, the swing state, Barack Obama, he needs to appeal to them. Is Mitt Romney going to get Mark Rubio to get that, to get that swing vote? Because it's all about the Latino. It's all important. Recently, of course, we had the Supreme Court decision talking about Arizona's SB 1070. Surprising a lot of people, really, and knocking down 3 of the 4 things that SB 1070 proposed. And all along, though, you have this is something that I've been dealing with my entire life, not just as a child of Mexican immigrants, one who came to this country in the trunk of a Chevy in 1968, but also as a reporter, again and again and again. What are Latinos? And when we're talking about Latinos, no one ever worries about Puerto Ricans anymore, or Cubans, or Dominicans. We're worrying about Mexicans. What on earth are Mexicans going to do this country? So in a way, I speak to you from the present, but really I speak to you from the future, because with the birth rates going as, with demographic changes, I am the future. I am speaking to you from the future here in the present. Multilingual, multicultural, and Mexican. And so I am one of those invading hordes. I am part of the Mexican hordes, and I'm here to tell you everything's going to be okay. Everything is, thank you, all right. Everything is going to be all right, and I have proof. Tacos. When I was talking to Alexis, what am I going to talk about? I gave him some titles, and one of them I said, should I talk about about the taco as Oracle? And so he insisted I do that. So I'm going to talk about tacos, but before I talk about, let me just talk a little bit about what probably gets me the most notoriety, going back to this telling of inconvenient truths. I write a column called Ask a Mexican. Ask a Mexican is exactly what it sounds like. People ask me questions about Mexicans, and I answer them. And it doesn't matter what the questions may be. It doesn't matter. I've answered questions on everything from why do Mexicans have so many babies to what part of illegal don't we understand to why don't Mexicans pay any taxes? We do, actually. In fact, some studies show we're actually supporting Social Security as we know it because of all those undocumented folks who are paying into the Social Security system with fake Social Security numbers that they're never going to get back, to why are Mexicans always so damn happy? I have answered all of it and more so. The column is now around 39 newspapers across the country. It was a best-selling book in 2007. You could always find it online, askamexican.net. And the reason I do the column is, it's a very specific reason, to debunk and deconstruct and frankly destroy stereotypes and misconceptions that people have about Mexicans, using the prism of satire, but really using the facts. My background is, as I said earlier, an investigative reporter. So when people ask me a question, for instance, my favorite question anybody ever asked me was, somebody asked me, why don't you Mexicans ever learn to speak English? Are you too stupid, too dumb? You can't learn 2 or 3 words a day? What's going on with you guys? It was a nice question. So all I had to do to answer that question was the facts. I went to them and I said, the American government shares your concerns. They issued a study saying that this new wave of immigrants are idiots. They're not like the previous wave of immigrants who came to this country to learn, to become Americans. You know, that rhetoric that you hear so much coming from the right and also from the left sometimes, and that we should have a policy of stopping all immigration, deporting all those immigrants, because all those immigrants, all they want to do is come to this country, take our money, take our jobs, and send them back. Well, that report wasn't from the modern day. It was a 1911 Dillingham Commission. And the idiot immigrants at the time were probably, you know, some of your ancestors here in this room, mostly Eastern and Southern Europeans, Italians, Greeks, Jews, Poles, not Spaniards to a lesser extent, Bulgarians and so forth. And the immigrants that we lionized from the past was, of course, Swedes, French, and the English. All I had to do was answer the facts. And of course, at the end, I put a whole bunch of chinga tu madres, and that's your answer. The column, of course, is not without its critics. Maybe at another time I could tell you about how my column actually got a man suspended from work for 5 days for reading it at his work. You can find it online. So in my job is trying to let people know it's okay, Mexicans are perfectly fine, and nothing, this country's going to be as great as it always has been with us, being the majority in some places. I decided to go with my most recent book on something that everyone could understand, Mexican food. So my new book, Taco USA, How Mexican Food Conquered America. I love titles that tell you everything you need to know from the subtitle, and that's exactly what it is, How Mexican Food Conquered America. Of course, the relationship between the United States and Mexico, we all know it's like the ultimate bad romance, really. We share a border, yet we've gotten into, 3 official wars, God knows how many unofficial wars. America is dependent on Mexican cheap labor. Mexico is dependent on all those remittances going back into Mexico. We have the drug war. We have all sorts of nasty battles that we always fight, but we have made our peace. We have made our peace on one thing, and that's food. In fact, more than made our peace, I would argue, we're showing you the future. Mexicans will be on top because we have already conquered your stomachs. So the book, really briefly, I'll talk about the book. Then I'm going to talk specifically about tacos. It goes through the 125-year history of Mexican food in this country. There's a misconception that Mexican food really didn't become popular until, say, the 1950s and 1960s with the spread of fast food Mexican joints like Taco Bell, Del Taco, Taco John's around these areas, and other taco empires going out in the East Coast. But really, from the moment the Americans have even heard about Mexican food, let alone tasted it, we have been obsessed. And so what's happened ever since the 1880s, there's been this cycle that continues to repeat itself every single decade. Americans hear about Mexican food, whether reading it, whether hearing about it from people who have tried it. They go out and seek it, whether going on vacation, whether cooking it from cookbooks, whether waiting for somebody to make it in front of them, whether at a restaurant or at home. They eat it, they devour it, they love it, they assimilate it, and then they say, what's next? Give us a next great dish. So from the 1880s and 1890s, the first 2 great Mexican foods that America fell in love with were not tacos, not even enchiladas, but what used to be called chile con carne, which we now know as chili, and we do in our church cook-offs, and tamales. Tamales, the great nexus point was the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, where you had tamale men from San Francisco go to the Chicago World's Fair, start selling their tamales from these steam buckets. You had the Texas delegation to the Chicago World's Fair go and start selling their own chile con carne. They're the Chicago canners, which, of course, at the time, Chicago was the center point of both the canning industry and the meatpacking industry in the United States. They decided to put this Mexican food in a can because for them, they saw both chile con carne and tamales as easy to put in a can, cheap, with a long shelf life. And after that, you had chili. Well, chili now, it's become so assimilated that most people don't even know it's Mexican. Tamales in a can, you can still find them, although at this point in time, why would you want to eat tamales in a can? Anyways, from there on then, Mexican food has conquered the United States again and again. 1900s, you started seeing the spread of chili powder created by a German immigrant named William Gebhardt out of New Braunfels, Texas, right outside San Antonio. In the 1920s, you see Gebhardt's printing a 250,000 cookbooks a year, going all across the United States, teaching people how to make Mexican food. 1930s, you start seeing the spread of tacos. 1940s and 50s, furthermore, the actual Mexican restaurants. 60s and 70s, you start seeing the spread of what's known as sit-down Mexican restaurants. Some of you in the audience may remember a restaurant chain called Chi-Chi's, which would never work in Southern California because that's slang for female breasts. We had El Torito, which makes more sense. And onward, what you see then is the spread of this, or the creation of a multi-billion-dollar Mexican food industry, not just in its totality, but in individual segments. Alcohol, hot sauce. Maybe you've heard the fact that I think it's this year, the 20th anniversary of salsa outselling ketchup, which is true. Taco Bell, multi-billion-dollar empire. Mexican canning, and so on and so forth. So what this shows to me, not only, and it's been Americans, by the way. It's been Americans who have been pushing and making all these foods popular. It hasn't been Mexicans. Mexicans have always been eating them, of course. But if it wasn't for the wide-scale embrace of Americans of Mexican food, none of this would have happened. And so for me, that shows that the future is bright, the future is positive, because we all know, especially when it comes to demonizing other cultures, the very first thing we demonize, besides the way maybe that they look, is their food. You still see some remnants of that in, when it comes to Mexican food. You might have heard the epithet beaners, although that's so 1950s. I don't know why people still use that. Greasers, of course, chili belly, and so forth. And in fact, the first dispatches, the first writings of Mexican food in American letters goes back to the 1830s, and they were scouts for the American Army going through Texas and New Mexico, prepping to conquer all that area for the United States, and they were saying how all that Mexican food was horrible. Enchiladas were terrible, tortillas were like cardboard. They started spreading rumors that, in fact, if you ate Mexican food, you would die. And in fact, this is true. During the Battle of San Jacinto for the Texas War for Independence, a rumor quickly spread that the vultures and condors, basically scavengers, would not eat the corpses of dead Mexican soldiers because those Mexican soldiers had so much chili in them that the animals would die. And even a decade later, you had you also had other writings that, cows went to that pasture where there were dead Mexicans and they died because all that chili was still there a decade later. But that's all in the past. That's all an undercurrent. Instead, we have Mexican food conquering us all. You have Mexican food now all across the globe. You have Mexican food on all continents. The intro to my book, Taco USA, it starts with breakfast burritos in space. Did you know that astronauts love tortillas? They don't like bread because if you eat bread, all those crumbs go into into their really fancy equipment. But the tortilla is God's vessel. In fact, why else would Jesus appear in a tortilla? That happened in 1978, Lake Arthur, New Mexico. Absolutely happened. So I see a positive future. And then one of the things that's really important to think about Mexican food, and this goes, another argument about this idea of authenticity. The great thing about Mexican food in this country is that none of it's authentic. All of it's authentic and none of it's authentic. You've seen Mexican food change in so many different ways over the years, and and the best evolution that you can see, or the most widespread evolution, has been in that humble taco. So tacos, when they're actually a late migrant to the United States. They didn't come to the United States until around the Mexican Revolution. Before that, what passed as Mexican food in this country was chile con carne, enchiladas, chile rellenos, of course, pinto beans, so on and so forth. But the first Mexican tacos to come to the United States were hard-shell tacos. In other words, fried tacos. You might have heard somewhere along the line that, Mexicans don't eat fried tacos. Yeah, right. Those were the very first tacos that came into this country. But the first popular tacos to come in were something called taquitos, which are, most of you have had this at this point in time. Rolled tortillas fried with some beef inside. Those were the first tacos that spread across the United States. Eventually, even before, remember, the mass Mexican migration to the United States outside of the Southwest didn't happen in earnest until after 1965. But even before then, there was a demand for tacos. By the 1950s, you see a gentleman from El Paso named George Ashley. And he's probably most famous for inventing tortillas in a can, which I want to taste, but they're now extinct because no one should ever eat tortillas in a can again. But he would sell these tortillas in a can and sell them across the country and tell housewives, here, if you send me 4 proofs of receipt, I'll send you a little shell so you can make your own tacos. You put these tortillas in this aluminum shell, you fry them, and then you make tacos. Became a multimillionaire out of that. The 1950s also sees the start of Glenn Bell of Taco Bell fame, finding the idea for his restaurant, for his tacos, out of a small restaurant in San Bernardino, which of course he created into a multi-billion-dollar empire. So you had the hard-shell taco passed off as a taco for the longest time, but what happened, of course, they started changing. The 1980s, you start seeing what's now known as a soft taco, what us Mexicans just call a taco, which is just corn tortilla with something inside. Right now in Southern California, you're seeing the spread of Korean tacos, basically a tortilla with Korean meat inside. And now you're seeing better tacos coming up from Mexico. You're seeing tacos árabes, which is basically a pita with al pastor, which actually comes from Lebanese, Arabs kind of, yeah, Lebanese. You're starting to see tacos acorazados, known as battleship tacos from the state of Cuernavaca. You're seeing all sorts of tacos. And probably, I think, the most glorious creation this country has ever made, tater tots tacos. Tater tots tacos you could find up here in the upper Midwest, courtesy of the Taco John's chain. I gotta say, as a Mexican coming from Southern California, going to Wyoming a couple years ago, South Dakota, needing his Mexican food, and seeing these tater tot tacos, I just shook my head and I said, why on earth are Americans so afraid of us? They have tater tots and tacos now. If that's not a harbinger of what's coming to this country, I don't know what is. Thank you so much.
We obviously have run over. You might have to move on, but it's pouring rain outside, so if you want to stay in where it's dry for a little while, we can do some questions. I know that we need to use a microphone, and is there somebody out there? There's somebody with a microphone. Like we said, this is a mixed Q&A, so you can ask questions of anybody. You can ask questions of multiple people. Any questions out there?
Oh, yeah, right there.
Hey, Jacob Gordon. This is for Matt, I guess, but anybody, of course, could chime in. You talk about people becoming more participant journalists themselves, and Alexis, you mentioned coding and technology. Is that part of your background and your passion as well?
I think it's hard to be involved in digital journalism and not get a little bit into the code. I have only deployed my first working web application this year, but since I started in newspapers, I've been making things with code, and I think that's a pattern for a lot of digital journalists.
And I wonder, do you see that happening with people who are contributing content? In New York, we have a group called Hackers, which are the people who sort of assign themselves to be both technologists and content creators. Do you see these people who are empowering themselves to be citizen journalists also wanting to hack, and people who are hacking not necessarily because they're really passionate about, say, writing, reporting, creating video, audio content, but because they want to build applications and things that, let's say, use a Twitter API or something like that?
Part of what I tell, especially aspiring young journalists in college, is that increasingly at news organizations, the folks who are making decisions that ultimately shape the stories that we tell are increasingly not editorial folks, but in fact folks who are making code and technology, people who can understand the data possibilities inherent in a particular story and can actually do fancy things with the database, have a huge sway over the types of stories that we can tell, the type of apps that we can develop. And you're seeing this sort of confluence between technology and media where what we thought of as tech companies, actually, they're becoming media companies. We have, the other day, I was supposed to give a talk with a fellow named Mark Lucky, who is a reporter for the Washington Post. But days before our talk began, it was announced that he was going to work at Twitter. We have journalists now working at Google and Facebook and all over the tech sphere, and conversely, we've got technologists working at all sorts of media organizations.
Adam, I wanted to ask you, do you see emerging artists realizing that coding and working with hardware are things that are like really, really valuable within contemporary art scene?
Yes, of course, and I think that there are a lot of artists who work with media, who work with technology and coding. In fact, data visualization is this weird world that combines art and data. I mean, it's funny because 10 years ago, I would have, when I would give the example of what like is the exact opposite of art, I would have said data, right? Like, well, it's not. I suppose I even might say that, like, well, it's not just data; it's art, you know. But now, of course, what's amazing is that like how we understand data is actually a visual phenomena. And yes, so there are a lot of people. Casey Reese is a great sort of artist who works in that area, based in LA, and wrote a book on the subject. But I think what's really amazing to me is that mostly in academic environments right now, though, like there are people who sort of see like their job as artists as like just like experimenters, as like working in a laboratory in a way with data, with different kinds of technology that's new, and they might not ever even think about exhibiting in a museum context. They talk to other academics and they publish what they're doing, but they, like for example, like the two artists in Montreal who created the like interactive like plant, so that you can actually touch the plant and the light would turn on. So it's electronically transmitting. Transmitting electronics through a plant. Those kind of things are the kind of like experimentation that takes place within the art world.
Just to give a sense of numbers, so the Guardian office in New York has about 30 people, and I think 4 or 5 of them are programmers, do data visualization. So it's a very, very high percentage. And I think compared to some other newsrooms, but it's growing. And when I was at ProPublica, which was about 30 people, there I think are 4 programmers on staff who are in charge of finding ways to scrape data and then turn it into a visual form for our readers.
Wow, that's amazing. That's interesting.
Another question right there. Maybe you could. Oh, great.
Hi, Rebecca Allen. Maybe to Adam or anyone. So I started working as an artist with the digital technology in the 70s, and it's amazing to me in the traditional art world that it maybe in the last 2 years it's starting to be accepted. I've been shocked that the art world has been so basically afraid to embrace digital art or understand it or figure out how to critique it. You know, video seemed to sneak into the art world, photography did. Do you have any sense of why it's been so long in coming in the art world?
But I think I think you probably know the answer to that yourself, right? Like, don't you think? Like, what would you suggest would be the answer? Like,
I'm not sure because I've been so much part of it.
It seems to me that the obvious is that like that it would be related to the marketplace, relationship between contemporary art and the marketplace. That actually it's so hard to commodify.
Yeah, because you don't have the original necessarily,
right,
and the one precious object, so the object
right,
was
exactly.
removed.
That's what I think it is.
But still, you know, video, which is the same kind of situation, has been accepted, you know, way back in the 60s even.
Yeah. Well, I think that one thing is that what a lot of video artists have done is tried as much as possible to, and the way that they've been successful is to make their video art into as much like a painting as possible, right? To make it rare, to make it you know, an edition work.
Yes.
To even the packages around video art are these beautiful sort of like gem-like packages that you're getting an object, you're not just getting a video. But I actually think it's because a lot of people working in technology are sort of on the borderline between like the data visualization that Amanda was talking about and the world of fine art. They actually like that boundary, and because and actually art world doesn't like it likes some boundaries, but it doesn't like others. And the one boundary it doesn't like is it doesn't like the boundary between what is art and what is just life, the world. Yeah. That's actually a boundary that's actually pretty scary.
So the art world has kept itself kind of fixed in the past, which is sort of disappointing when you expected art to lead us into the future.
Maybe.
Other questions out there? Yeah, maybe one more question, and then I'm sure everyone will stick around. Sure. There's a mic coming in. Oh, there's a mic coming away.
You have to talk to the mic.
Hi, Mary Houston speaking here. Listening to all of you as innovators in your fields and also very aware of the interdisciplinary nature of your disciplines. As someone having a 15-year-old son who's in the digital world all the time, I worry not only for myself, there's a lot of noise. And So as people, we need to figure out what's the most important part to listen to. The streaming was talked about, changing kind of the venue of museums and making them, participatory, unveiling the snobbery, making it a conversation. In politics and journalism, using the people, your listeners, as messengers, really. But how do you view the creation of classic journalism? I mean, what is going to live on in your lifetime? Which pieces?
Can I direct that one to Gustavo?
Yeah.
Yeah, the story is a story. Especially being part of the alt weekly world, we've always focused on the story, and it doesn't matter if you write a book or you write a tweet. If it's not something that's going to grab people in one way or another, it's just not going to stick around anywhere. I always tell my writers that whatever you do, make sure that you're able to stand by it and say, this is the best damn thing I was able to do in whatever form you're at. So, in going on Twitter and going on Facebook, I don't just fire things off randomly. I make sure everything that I do is put precisely. Although, of course, it depends also, like, say a field like Twitter where you have 140 characters versus something like Facebook where you can link to a video, where you can make your own video or take a picture with a caption to making a book. As a reporter, you just have to make sure that you have to trust in what you're going to do is going to grab people. And you have really, it's like, you jump into, you just jump into the abyss and hope for the best.
I was going to invoke our mutual friend again, Robin Sloan, who wrote this great post, actually, in part a response to this, I think, where he said that one of the master media metaphors of our time is stock and flow, which he appropriated from economics. And he said that in this new media environment, we find ourselves constantly in flow. And the real challenge is how to figure out the lasting, durable goods and stories. I mean, I second everything you said about stories. I think the real challenge is, frankly, it's not easy, and it's very much incumbent on us, and it's a real sort of responsibility. And there are different ways of going about it. Like, some of the shortcuts might be finding people who cover issues that you care about and think are important, and you trust their analysis, and they become in ways your filter of the world. But there's no easy solution.
We're going to wrap. I just wanted to say thank you for invoking the stock and flow, because when we were creating the intro this morning, we were going to talk about that, and it kind of answers or speaks to your question in the sense that part of the point of that story is that he's saying you can't always be inside of the flow of that digital overload like your son might be. You have to also step out. You also have to also be a creator of the stuff. You can't only be a consumer of the stuff, and you have to find the balance between those things. So I think that might be a nice way to finish off. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thank you.